My name is Rose Foster, and what I'm about to share with you changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. I never expected to have a near-death experience, especially not one that would reveal the startling truth about what happens to atheists in the afterlife. But here I am, compelled to share this story that might just change your perspective forever. Before I begin, I want to be clear. I was a devoted atheist for 32 years of my life. I wasn't just passive about it. I was the kind of person who would actively debate believers and pride myself on what I thought was my rational, scientific worldview. I had it all figured out, or so I thought. That changed on October 12th, 2023. I was driving home from my job as a biochemistry professor at the local university. It was a routine Thursday evening, and I was mentally preparing my lecture for the next day about cellular respiration. The irony doesn't escape me now. How I was thinking about the scientific process of life while being minutes away from experiencing death. The roads were wet from an earlier rainfall, and visibility wasn't great. I remember checking my rearview mirror and seeing headlights approaching far too quickly. Before I could react, I felt the impact. My car spun out of control, and everything after that came in fragments. The screech of metal, the shattering of glass, and a sensation of being airborne. Then, darkness. But that darkness wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The first thing I noticed was the absence of pain. One moment I was in my mangled car, and the next, I felt a peculiar lightness. It's difficult to describe the transition. It was like waking up from a dream, except you're waking up into something more real than what you've ever experienced before. I found myself in what I can only describe as a vast space, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with what I now understand to be pure consciousness. The closest analogy I can give is this. Imagine being submerged in an ocean of awareness, where every molecule of water is a thought, a memory, or a truth. The space around me seemed to pulse with life and intelligence. As a scientist, my first instinct was to try to rationalize what was happening. Was this a hallucination caused by trauma? Were these just the random firings of a dying brain? But something deep within me knew this was different. The clarity was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sharper than any waking moment, more lucid than any dream. Then I noticed I wasn't alone. A presence approached me. I say approached, but it wasn't physical movement as we understand it. It was more like the presence became more focused on me, and I became more aware of it. The being was made of what I can only describe as living light, but not light as we know it. This light carried intelligence, emotion, and most surprisingly, love. Pure, unconditional love that made every human love I'd ever experienced seem like a shadow in comparison. The being communicated with me, not through words, but through direct understanding. Thoughts, emotions, and entire concepts would simply appear in my consciousness. The first thing it conveyed was something that shook me to my core. You have known about me all along. In that moment, I understood what it meant. Throughout my life as an atheist, I had felt what I called the wonder of science, that sense of awe when discovering how the universe works, that feeling of connection when understanding the intricate dance of atoms and stars. What I had labeled as purely scientific appreciation was actually my soul recognizing its creator. The being, whom I now know was a divine messenger, showed me something extraordinary. It was like a living tapestry of my life, but not just the events as they happened. I saw how every moment of doubt, every argument against faith, every time I'd proudly declared my atheism had actually been opportunities for growth and discovery. But here's what really stunned me. I saw that God had never been angry with my atheism. Instead, He had been patiently waiting, respecting my free will, while leaving breadcrumbs of His existence throughout my life. The messenger then showed me something that I believe I was meant to share with others. I was shown what happens to atheists after death, and it wasn't what I expected at all. I saw that the common conception of hell as a place of arbitrary punishment was far from the truth. Instead, I was shown that separation from God is something we choose, not something inflicted upon us. The messenger shared this concept through a powerful analogy. Imagine you're invited to the most beautiful celebration ever conceived. The host has prepared everything with you in mind, knows exactly what would bring you joy, and loves you deeply. But you've convinced yourself the host doesn't exist, and the invitation isn't real. When the time comes, you simply stay home, separating yourself from the celebration not because you weren't wanted, but because you chose not to believe in it. The messenger showed me countless souls who had made this choice. The painful part wasn't that God had rejected them. He never did. The pain came from finally seeing the full reality and understanding what they had rejected. It was like a person standing in darkness, insisting there is no such thing as light, while light is actually all around them, waiting for them to simply open their eyes. But here's the most important part. I was shown that every atheist's journey is unique. Some, like myself, needed to approach God through the lens of science and reason. Others found him through experiences of love, beauty, or even suffering. The common thread was that God was constantly reaching out in ways that would make sense to each individual, respecting their intellect and free will while never forcing belief. The messenger then showed me something that brought me to tears. The moments in my life when I thought I was alone, but wasn't. Every time I had marveled at the precision of molecular biology, every time I had felt overwhelmed by the beauty of a mathematical equation, every time I had felt inexplicably moved by a sunset, God had been there, speaking to me in the language I could understand best, the language of science and natural law. I was shown how my scientific mind wasn't an obstacle to faith, as I had always assumed, but actually a gift that could help me understand God's creation in a unique way. The messenger revealed how many of history's greatest scientists had found that their discoveries led them closer to, not further from, God. Then came the most profound part of my experience. The messenger showed me what happens in the moment of death, for both believers and non-believers. What I saw changed my understanding completely. Every soul, at the moment of death, experiences absolute clarity about the reality of God's existence. The difference isn't in what they see, but in how prepared they are for what they see. I watched as souls who had lived their lives acknowledging God transitioned smoothly into this greater reality, like fish finally understanding they had been swimming in water all along. But souls who had denied God's existence experienced something different. They weren't punished or rejected. Instead, they faced the challenge of reconciling their lifetime of denial with the undeniable reality before them. The messenger explained this through another analogy. Imagine spending your whole life insisting that music doesn't exist, then suddenly being immersed in a magnificent symphony. The music itself isn't punishment, but the sudden realization of how much you've missed, how many opportunities for joy you've denied yourself, creates its own kind of anguish. I was shown that this is why sharing this truth is so important. It's not about forcing beliefs on others or threatening them with punishment. It's about helping people prepare for a reality that everyone will eventually face. The messenger showed me how many atheists are actually closer to God than they realize. Their commitment to truth, their desire to understand the universe, their appreciation for evidence, these are all valuable traits that can lead to God when properly directed. The experience then took an unexpected turn. The messenger began showing me specific moments from history, times when human understanding of the universe seemed to conflict with faith, only to later reveal deeper truths that harmonized both. I saw how many scientific discoveries that were initially seen as challenges to faith actually revealed more of God's intricate design. But what really struck me was being shown the future. Not specific events, but the potential consequences of choices being made now. I saw how the current divide between faith and reason was causing unnecessary suffering on both sides. Scientists missing the deeper meaning behind their discoveries, believers afraid to fully engage with scientific truth, both groups missing out on the full picture of reality. The messenger then showed me something that made me understand why I was being allowed to return. I saw rooms full of students, much like the ones I taught, struggling with the same questions I had struggled with. I saw how my experience as both a scientist and someone who had discovered the truth about God could help bridge the gap for others who were searching. Throughout all of this, I was aware of an overwhelming love, not just from the messenger, but from the source of all existence. This love was nothing like what I had imagined as an atheist when I heard believers talk about God's love. It was more real, more rational, and more encompassing than anything I could have conceived. It was like discovering that what I had thought was a two-dimensional drawing of love was actually an infinite, multi-dimensional reality. The messenger showed me how this love operates in the universe, not just as an emotion, but as a fundamental force more basic than gravity or electromagnetism. I saw how it held atoms together, moved planets in their orbits, and bound human consciousness to the greater consciousness of God. As a scientist, I was amazed to see how love wasn't just a poetic concept, but a real, measurable force that underpinned all of reality. Then came the moment of choice. The messenger showed me two paths. I could stay in this reality of pure truth and love, or I could return to share what I had learned. The choice was genuinely mine, but I was shown the potential impact of my return. I saw how my story could help others, not just atheists, but anyone struggling to reconcile faith with reason. I chose to return, and that's why I'm sharing this story now. The return to my body was jarring. I later learned that I had been clinically dead for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The emergency room doctors had been about to call time of death when my heart suddenly started beating again. The medical staff called it a miracle, and now I understand why. The physical recovery was difficult. I had multiple broken bones, internal injuries, and a long road of rehabilitation ahead. But none of that seemed as important as the truth I had discovered. Every moment of physical pain was offset by the joy of knowing what I now knew. My colleagues at the university noticed the change in me immediately. How could they not? I was no longer the person who dismissed faith as primitive superstition. Instead, I had become someone who saw the harmony between science and faith, someone who could speak both languages fluently. Some of my atheist friends were understandably skeptical of my experience. I understand their skepticism. I would have been skeptical too. But I've noticed something interesting. When I share my story not as an argument to win, but as a truth to consider, even the most hardened skeptics find themselves wondering. The most profound change has been in how I view my role as a scientist. I no longer see science as a tool to disprove God, but as a means to understand His creation more deeply. Every discovery in the lab now feels like reading another page in God's book of nature. The precision of molecular machines, the elegance of physical laws, the complexity of living systems, all of it points to a mind of unimaginable intelligence. I've also gained a new perspective on why some people choose atheism. The messenger showed me that many atheists are actually reacting against misrepresentations of God, rather than God Himself. They're rejecting a caricature of faith that bears little resemblance to the actual truth. This understanding has helped me have more productive conversations with skeptics, meeting them where they are rather than trying to force them into a predetermined box. Since my experience, I've dedicated much of my free time to creating bridges between the scientific and religious communities. I've found that when both sides truly listen to each other, they often discover they're looking at the same truth from different angles. But the most important message I want to share is this. God's love for atheists isn't diminished by their disbelief. Just as a parent doesn't stop loving a child who denies their existence, God's love remains constant. The tragedy isn't in God's response to atheism, but in the self-imposed separation that atheists choose, often without realizing what they're separating themselves from. I was shown that this separation isn't permanent unless we make it so. Even after death, the opportunity to recognize and accept truth remains. However, the messenger made it clear that waiting until after death makes the transition much more difficult, like trying to learn a language when you suddenly find yourself in a country where everyone speaks it. This brings me to the most crucial part of what I learned. The purpose of life isn't to blindly believe or to figure everything out on our own. It's to develop our capacity to recognize and respond to truth, to cultivate our ability to love, and to prepare ourselves for a reality far more magnificent than our limited earthly perspectives can imagine. To my atheist friends who might be reading or listening to this, I understand your skepticism. I respect your commitment to truth and evidence. I'm not asking you to abandon your rational mind or your scientific principles. Instead, I'm inviting you to consider that the universe might be more mysterious and meaningful than we once thought. To my religious friends, remember that many atheists are sincerely seeking truth. Their questions and doubts aren't threats to faith, but opportunities for deeper understanding. The God I encountered is big enough to handle all our questions and patient enough to wait for us to find our way to Him. Since my near-death experience, I've received thousands of messages from people around the world, atheists, believers, and those somewhere in between. Many have shared their own experiences of touching the divine, often in ways they were afraid to talk about before. This has convinced me more than ever that my experience wasn't just for me. It was meant to be shared. I continue to teach science, but now with a deeper appreciation for the mysteries we study. I still value evidence and rational inquiry, but I've learned that some truths can only be fully understood when we're willing to expand our definition of what constitutes evidence. The accident that nearly killed me happened over a year ago, but in many ways, I feel like my life only truly began after that experience. Every day, I discover new connections between the scientific truths I've studied all my life and the spiritual truths I was shown in those moments between life and death. I don't expect everyone who reads or hears this story to immediately change their beliefs. That's not the point. The point is to share what I learned about God's perspective on atheists, that they are deeply loved, that their search for truth is respected, and that the door to understanding is always open. Remember, the universe is not a cold, meaningless void as I once believed. It's a love letter written in the language of physics, chemistry, and biology, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look with both their mind and their heart. This is my story, but in a way, it's everyone's story. It's about the journey from darkness to light, from skepticism to understanding, from isolation to connection with the source of all being. Whether you believe my experience or not, I hope it encourages you to look deeper, to question your assumptions, and to remain open to the possibility that the universe is far more wonderful than any of us imagined. Thank you for letting me share this truth with you. Whatever you believe right now, know that you are loved more deeply than you can imagine, and that the truth is waiting for you to discover it, in this life or the next.